Ontario Premier Doug Ford is doubling down on his push to possibly cut Mexico from the North American trade agreement, saying all of Canada's premiers are aligned.
We just got off the phone with all the premiers, and there's a clear consensus that everyone agrees that we need a bilateral trade deal with the U.S. and a separate bilateral trade deal with Mexico. I wouldn't say it's the end of free trade. I'd never recommend that. I just feel that we need to work with our #1 trading partner.
Ford says Mexico has allowed itself to become a backdoor for Chinese cars, auto parts, and other products. The federal government says it has been speaking to both the U.S. and Mexico about these concerns.
When it comes to security, strategic supply chain, and a growth agenda, that Canada and the United States are very aligned. And therefore, we've been saying also to our Mexican friends that we understand the concerns that have been raised by our U.S. counterpart with respect to making sure that we protect critical strategic supply chain in North America.
The power panel's back on this. Emily Nicola, Amanda Alvaro, James Moore, and Brad Levine. Just add a little bit of context there, gang, to what Doug Ford said today. Andrew Furey's in town, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, and our Chris Rand's caught up with him. And he says the consensus at the Premier's table was that should the old agreement fail, we would be interested in supporting 2 separate bilateral agreements. So it's not a call to tear up NAFTA, Emily, as it exists, or CUSMA or USMCA. It's a be willing to go this route should the disruption from south of the border be so severe that the current trade deal falls apart, or if Mexico doesn't get on board with what they're calling for. So how do you see this? The premiers are kind of running a separate negotiation here in public before the Trump cabinet's even sworn in.
I love that language. Should the disruption be so severe?
Yeah.
Because it speaks to the level of fear that exists in Premier's office, in the Prime Minister's office, certainly in Minister Philippe Champagne's office. And obviously, they're not going to say that on the air. It's not going to be part of any public language. But there is a level of, oh my God, Donald Trump got elected, what are we going to do now? And that is very, very clear from what's happening today. So that we are now talking about making in public, talking about throwing Mexico under the bus for an agreement that's still in place till 2026. And there's so many different variables at play. But one thing I will say, though, is that although I understand that obviously Canada and the U.S. are more aligned, and that if Mexico is trading with China at a different level, it underscores or underplays what Canada and the U.S. have been trying to do in terms of getting away from China. But at the same time, for us Canadians, what it means is that we're likely to get into a situation where our codependency with the Americans is likely to increase precisely because we're afraid of losing their favors. And I don't know how that's playing well for us in the long term. This idea that because we're afraid to lose the U.S., we're going to be losing even more people or getting a little bit further away from even more people. The midterm, long-term interest of Canada, I think we're getting ourselves into a threat that might have consequences that we're not foreseeing right now, that we're just into panic mode because Donald Trump got elected.
Right. Brad, he didn't just get elected. He seems more determined, more emboldened, and definitely more experienced than last time when he didn't quite have a team around him that was fully aligned with his agenda, and there was some inexperience there in how to run a government as big and as complex as the United States. But this time, it seems like a more deliberative and determined process, and you can understand the anxiety. But is the way the premiers are doing this, is this the right way to go about it? It's almost like they're negotiating against themselves in public right now.
Yeah, that's very true. I think there's also some political calculations here. Premier Ford is likely to go to the polls in Ontario in the early months of 2025. So he's getting out of, obviously there's still long runway on the mandate. So the trigger for him to say, this is why I want an election in Ontario. First of all, he needs to beat Trudeau to the polls so that he can run against Trudeau in the provincial election. But two, he can say that he's got a mandate. Obviously, the auto sector is very, very important to the province of Ontario, but there's other sectors that are also very important to other parts of the country. #1 trading issue is oil and gas. Donald Trump talked about not increasing and reducing the cost of gasoline in the U.S. And so when we look at things like tariffs and we look at things like trade deals, you can see that obviously some of the premiers are going to be talking in negotiations. I think all of this talk right now is part of a very long negotiation process to try to impress the new White House and the cabinet.
James, you advised the government as part of the NAFTA Council during the Trump 1 and during the last review and renegotiation of this. I mean, what does this dynamic of the premiers, led by Doug Ford, weighing in do to things?
Look, there's not a lot of discussion, I think, in informed media and not a lot of academic sort of discussion about the Canada-Mexico relationship or the tripartite relationship in sort of contemporary times post-Kuzma. So I think having a debate out loud is perfectly fine. I think François-Philippe Champagne had the right diplomatic tone there, which I think will be mirrored by Pierre Poilievre, Michael Chong, and others sort of in the foreign policy universe of the conservative world as well, which is to say, keep your powder dry. If you're asked about this, Premier Ford has an opinion. 2026 is a long way away. We wait to see what President Trump has to do. We wait to see whether or not, who he furnishes his cabinet with, and whether or not Bob Lighthizer will be back and will engage appropriately and responsibly. Keep it at a high level. But having a debate about this is reasonable because there's a lot going on in Mexico that should be of concern to Canada and is of concern to the United States. Not least of which is sort of the greenfield investments of China that are compromising the integrity of the North American platform because China is finding a backdoor way in, let alone the border politics between Mexico and the United States, let alone the fentanyl issue, let alone the outmigration that may be happening and the deportations by President Trump, a lot of which will be problematic for both Canada and Mexico and what the knock-on effects of that will be. There's a lot going on here and a lot in this space. And don't forget, there are also a lot of ill feelings, appropriately so, that Mexico boxed out Canada in the negotiations for Kuzma and frankly threw Canada under the bus or tried to in some ways as well. So it's a complicated relationship. We should play the long game through until 2026. There are reasons why a binational agreement between Canada and the United States would be accretive to Canada. There are a lot of things we can do on labor mobility that you can't do with Mexico in the room. Right. There's a lot of stuff that you can do on climate change that you can't do with Mexico in the room. So there's a lot to do between now and 26 to figure out what the best position is for Canada.
Amanda, how do you see all of this? I mean, is it helpful that the premiers are doing this? I know I spoke with someone when Doug Ford first did this in the Trudeau government saying, did you guys plan this? They're like, no, didn't get a heads up. But, a bad cop like this is not necessarily a bad thing. We don't mind it. But they just didn't ask for it. And that's just the way Doug is, right?
Of course. I think that there's a few things at play here. I think, first of all, to underscore Emily's point, there is this underlying anxiety that leaders are facing right now, wondering how creatively to deal with the new president-elect and what that could look like. And obviously, the consideration for Canada right now are the tariffs and this enormous trade relationship that we have. So borrowing on the equity that we had from being able to strike that agreement the first time around, but this time around there are so many other variables at play. And I think when you hear the ministers being clipped, you do hear that diplomatic tone, which is to say, kind of like anything's on the table. But we're more than a year away from that agreement being renegotiated. So they have to, I think, maintain that tone. For Premier Ford, it's an entirely different game. It's absolutely a political game. He wants to go to the polls. This is a big headline driver for him. If ultimately they are seen to be pursuing a bilateral agreement, he can wave the credit flag to say, I was the one who put it out there. I was the one who gained consensus with the premiers, and he can take some credit for that. If they don't and things go sideways, he can also take credit for that. So it's a win-win for him. He has nothing to lose in putting out ideas at a time when everyone feels like anything could be on the table.
So Emily, though, on this, I'm getting whiplash because in 2017, 2016, everybody rallied to the Canadian flag to save NAFTA, and now everyone is rallying to the Premier's table, at least, to say, you know what, maybe we need to think about life after NAFTA. I mean, how do you think Canadians are going to view this, right? Given that James made some good points, there are certain things you can only do with the U.S. at the table, not with Mexico necessarily because of the structure and shape of the economies. But how do you think it affects the public understanding of this issue?
I think It's very possible for Canada and the U.S. to have a relationship and Canada and Mexico to have a relationship. I think that's not what changes things for Canadians from a sense of, global understanding. I think what a lot of Canadians are worried about, just politically in general, beyond the details of the specific trade agreement, is that whatever the Americans do, we're caught with the consequences of it, and that we seem to be losing a form of our sovereignty economically to the Americans, is that the Americans are deciding for us, and we're basically so integrated with them economically that we're basically a part of the U.S. at this point, economically speaking, and that we are not necessarily engaging with players internationally on a lot of policy levels that have nothing to do with the economy in the way that Canada used to in the 90s or even in the early 2000s. And so there's a question of whether or not Canada is too close to the U.S. and at what expense or at what cost to our relationship with the rest of the world. I think Canadians are interested about that so much that we started to follow the Americans' election as if it was our own election. And so there's something there that is brewing, and this trade agreement is one of the elements of it, but really our closeness to the Americans, I think that's something that a lot of Canadians have a lot of things to say about.
Well, Brad, is it a question of sovereignty or just a recognition of rational self-interest? Because, the $4 billion a day going back and forth across the border, and I don't think you have this conversation to the same degree if Kamala Harris wins that election, but she didn't. And so here we are, right? You kind of have to, you got to copper fasten your economy, otherwise it gets pulled out from underneath you is the concern, right?
Yeah, and I think that one of the features of the Trump playbook is constant chaos. Why? Because it makes those with whom you're negotiating in 2026, it makes, if we don't know what Trump is going to do next, it gives him leverage that Canadians wouldn't have had we had, let's say, a Democrat in the White House. So the chaos is part of the playbook, and so I think we have to respond to that. It's not the same as the 2016 term. This will be a lot, as we were saying at the outset, a little bit more methodical. He's had more time to think about what it is he wishes to achieve. What I find fascinating about all this is, of course, cut my teeth on the '88 election, and it seems like more and more conservatives, particularly American conservatives, sound a lot like New Democrats did in the 80s. You want to talk about whiplash? Yeah. I'm feeling the same, a lot of the same positioning from different sides of the aisle.
I can see Donald Trump running an ad through a pack of the border being erased, by a pencil, and it's going to be with Trump voicing over. Okay. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's return to the White House brings with it some uncertainty over key trading relationships. While he was on the campaign trail, Trump promised to renegotiate the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement.
Upon taking office, I will formally notify Mexico and Canada of my intention to invoke the 6-year renegotiation provisions of the USMCA that I put in. I said, nope, I want to be able to renegotiate in 6 years, otherwise we're not making the deal. And I got it, and it's coming due very soon. Oh, I'm going to have a lot of fun.
Well, that fun has led to a lot of concern on this side of the border. Just today, Ontario Premier Doug Ford says if it comes to it, Canadian premiers would support cutting Mexico out of the deal.
We just got off the phone with all the premiers, and there's a clear consensus that everyone agrees that we need a bilateral trade deal with the U.S. and a separate bilateral trade deal with Mexico. I wouldn't say it's the end of free trade. I'd never recommend that. I just feel that we need to work with our #1 trading partner.
Dennis Darby represents Canadian manufacturers and exporters, and Jay Timmons represents U.S. national manufacturers. Gentlemen, good to see you both. Thank you for being here today.
Good to be here.
Dennis Darby, I want to start with you on what appears to be a lot of political concern at the provincial level about the future of trade in North America. Premier Doug Ford said today that Canada's premiers are willing to see the end of NAFTA 2.0 and do bilateral deals if that's what it takes. What are your thoughts on that as a CME?
I can understand there's a lot of reaction by the premiers, especially in Ontario, which is so dependent on trade and manufacturing. It depends on trade with the U.S. But I seriously think that at this stage, these early days, it's probably best that we don't negotiate with ourselves and maybe start by trying to do what we're doing this week, is bringing together manufacturers from all 3 countries to start thinking about how do we help facilitate, the change. Even with Mr. Trump in power, we're looking forward to 2026 and how we can enhance, and because this has been such an important and very, very successful trade arrangement.
Right, and we should point out, Jay Timmins, this is the position of the Premier of Canada's largest province. It is not the position of the federal government. But what do you make of this? The looming change in management in the United States has a lot of anxiety at the First Minister's table up here.
Well, so obviously things are going to be different after January the 20th. President Trump has been very clear about his priorities, his commitments. And I think everyone in the business community and in adjoining governments need to be approaching this with very clear eyes. They need to know that what Donald Trump says, Donald Trump means. Now, having said that, Donald Trump wants to see manufacturing in the United States grow and thrive. And the CUSMA agreement has demonstrated that the regional economic activity that has been generated has been beneficial for all three countries. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt, though, and I think this is really important, no matter what we're talking about in the future, what an agreement looks like, is there is no light between Canada and the United States when it comes to our shared values, our shared history. And so that special relationship will be strengthened no matter what happens. But we believe that Mexico, being a part of this economic agreement, makes all of us even stronger.
Dennis Darby, do you share that optimism? Because there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the Canadian government about exactly how Donald Trump's policy of global tariffs would apply to Canada, how it would apply to the trade pact, whether we're inside the tariff wall or on the other side of it.
Well, I think, Jay's right. We have been mostly inside the tent, and we have been, as you can see, even recently with the tariffs on Chinese EVs and metals. We've been working in lockstep, and that is the right approach, because we are so integrated in our supply chains. It's hard to imagine how we could disentangle. But I think Canada has to be sharp in its game and in discussions with the new administration about how our prosperity, it actually helps build their prosperity, and I think that's going to be the focus going forward, at least as we understand it.
So, Dave, I think it's also really important to note that we do have issues with some of our trading partners. And look, let me put it out there. It's China that has caused a lot of angst for not only the incoming Trump administration, the previous Trump administration, the Biden administration, the Obama administration. This is a long-term issue that we're dealing with. If the president decides to use the tariff tool to deal with a playing field that hasn't been level, then doing that in a very strategically targeted way that impacts specific policies, whether that's dumping or counterfeiting or intellectual property theft, that's the way that we're going to enhance manufacturing in the North American region while making sure that we don't have unfair competition coming in.
Okay, I want to ask you about how that applies to Mexico. And I should point out, your Mexican counterpart was invited to be here, was supposed to be here, but a scheduling conflict. They were not cut out of the conversation. I want to assure you that. But just on that, Jay Timmins, I mean, it's the transshipment through Mexico that Doug Ford is worried about. Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, has expressed concern about, and clearly something that worries the incoming Trump administration. So how do you see that applying in dealing with that issue? Could the tariffs just be on the southern border, not on the northern border? What's your thoughts there?
I'm not going to get ahead of President Trump, because there wouldn't be any way to do that. But I think that we all should be concerned if the letter and the spirit of the agreement are not being followed. Mm-hmm. So Canada has a new administration as well, and President Sheinbaum has indicated
Mexico,
that...
you mean? Sorry, you said Canada, but President Sheinbaum's the new Mexico.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I got you. Go ahead.
You haven't had elections yet.
Not yet.
But yes, President Sheinbaum in Mexico has indicated that she wants to make sure that the agreement is ratified for the future, is moved forward. So they know that they have issues that they have to deal with. I mean, they have issues with the independent agencies and the judiciary that constitutional amendments have made problematic for the United States, and I would think Canada as well. And they also have some issues with takings of private property of American manufacturers. Those things can't stand. So those are issues that will have to be addressed as the review process occurs in 2026. But hopefully, the new administration in Mexico will address those things before then.
If I could, Dave, one of the things I think when I listened to Premier Ford and Premier Smith, is really about somewhat of a shot across the bow for for Mexico. It's in our best interest, Canada, U.S., and Mexico, for this to work. And if what that requires is Mexico to come in line with the rest of North America, it's important. But I think, and so that might be part of the message. Not so much we're going to cut you out, but maybe, well, we need you to rectify some of these issues that Jay mentioned, so that we can go forward. Because otherwise, you end up with, you end up with a much weaker economic model.
No, I spoke with senior people in the Canadian government when Doug Ford made his comments initially, and there was no coordination here, they insist. But they weren't all too unhappy, Dennis, to have a bad cop out there so they can be the good cop at the table. I don't know if you think that is what is happening here in terms of like a tactical approach to this, but it's clear the Canada-U.S. relationship is the most valuable one and the one that the premiers all prioritize. But the supply chain is pretty integrated across continentally.
It certainly is important, but we have Canadian companies who are invested in all three countries.
Right.
American companies invested in all three countries. So, so if that's a tactic to try to get Mexico, to scare them straight, well then, it might work. And because we really do want to be in a situation where this does work and we can renew CUSMA, and that we do avoid sort of blanket tariffs, because we can demonstrate the importance of what we do in Canada and in Mexico to the U.S. prosperity.
So, Jay Timmons, I know you say you won't get ahead of President Trump, but if you were asked by President Trump or any other senior members of his administration as he fills out the ranks of his cabinet, what would you advise them on what to do, on the approach to dealing with this on a North American scale? Would you have the NAFTA partners inside the trade wall?
Well, absolutely, because again, it has proven to be very effective and very successful. Having said that, it's not a question, I don't believe, of advising the incoming administration on what our position or the position of manufacturers across America may or may not be. This president-elect, has come in with a very set agenda. We know exactly what he intends to do. So again, if he chooses to use the tariff tool that is available to him, we would suggest that be very strategically targeted so that we are not harming manufacturers. And especially the manufacturers that you really want to pay attention to are the small and medium manufacturers that frankly are not as, they're not as agile to be able to deal with changes in like tariff policy as larger manufacturers. So being strategic, being targeted, that seems to be the balance that everybody's trying to achieve, including the president-elect.
So not a global tariff, as some people have suggested, more specific, like it was an irritant the last time, the national security tariffs, the Section 232 on Canadian steel and aluminum, but applied to China, applied to specific bad actors, that kind of an approach? Jay Timmons, is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, so I think if you need to look at who's causing the disruption, who's causing the problem, what is the policy that is causing the issue, and you need to really go right after that. Otherwise, they're not going to be effective.
So Dennis Darby, if Canada does align with the United States to deal with the Trump agenda right now, does that compromise CETA? Does that compromise CPTPP, the ability to work with the Asian trade markets and the European trade markets under the agreement side there? And do you have to consider leaving the World Trade Organization dispute process if you agree to tariffs that sort of go outside normal trade practices?
Well, no, I don't, because in the current agreement, in the current CUSMA agreement, there is a whole section on dealing with third-party countries who unfair trade practices. We haven't done anything with it since we renegotiated. So it's already it's part of our rules-based approach already. So I don't think there's any risk for Canada in those other agreements.
Okay, so Jay Timmons, just as a last point, how much disruption should Canada be bracing for here, do you think? I mean, Trump, this is his trade deal from his first presidency, and he called it the greatest trade deal ever. It seems like you wouldn't want to torpedo something that you built and praised. So how broad do you think the disruption might be?
Well, look, again, I think that between Canada and the United States, we agree that we need to play by the rules. I think the previous administration in Mexico perhaps didn't see it quite that way. We're looking forward to a Sheinbaum administration that can do a course correction. I think the other thing that's important to understand about strengthening the manufacturing sector in the United States, it's not just about trade. Obviously, we want to be able to sell our products to other markets around the world. But in order to attract investment in the United States, we have to have the right tax policy, the right regulatory policies, the right workforce policies, the right energy policies. And the president-elect seems to be focused on all of those areas as well. So I feel pretty good about a continued manufacturing revival and renaissance in the United States. I think that's good for the whole region.
Jay Timmons, President and CEO of the National Association of Manufacturers, and Dennis Darby, President and CEO at Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, speaking of not knowing what's coming next, let's get to your pick, because it's Canada's relationship with Mexico, and Doug Ford seems to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, in addition to leading the largest province in Canada. What are your thoughts here?
Seriously.
Yeah, well, I mean, my first thought was Donald Trump isn't even in the White House yet, and Canada's already throwing Mexico off the boat. It really didn't take long for Canada to decide that if it was going to pick a partner in this dance, it was going to be Donald Trump and the United States. Obviously, Canada's trade with the United States far outweighs its trade with Mexico, but Mexico is still our third largest trading partner behind the U.S. and China. So it is not a relationship that Canada can take lightly. I believe in the last negotiations for the first, with Trump for the sort of the new NAFTA that's there now, Mexico and Canada helped each other a lot in that. And then Mexico kind of threw Canada off the bus by signing the deal early and making Canada sort of look bad and come scrambling at the end. So there's always been a little bit of tension around these negotiations to begin with. But this really is a sign that the Liberal government at least intends to how they intend to play the Donald Trump relationship and the relationship with the U.S. heading into that, and sort of they're throwing all of their cards on the table, including China, which has obviously a big connection to this story.
You know, Jason, I had Danielle Smith on the show last week, and she agreed with Doug Ford right away, saying, look, if Mexico's getting in the way, then we got to cut them out. Andrew Furey's in Ottawa today, the Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador. He says it's a little bit more nuanced than Doug Ford would have you believe, basically saying that if the current agreement fails, they're open to bilateral negotiations with the U.S. and then a separate one with Mexico. They're not saying let's tear up NAFTA 2.0 and go in a different direction. But either way, there is this anxiety about what the disruption in the White House, the new management that's coming in, is going to mean for things.
I mean, the if is important here. We can't underline it enough. And I do wonder if, even if without Trump, if they would have gotten to a point at some point where the premiers and the Canadian government were actually saying that Mexico has to shape up, not to kick them out of NAFTA. Of course, that's the way to make nice with the incoming bosses down south of the border in the States. But with regards to this, and you were talking about it before, the threat of backshoring. Sorry, that's not the right term. But the threat of back channeling, nearshoring, the Mexican product into Chinese EV products into Mexico. I mean, that, this is an area where, while yes, it's CUSMA, Canada and U.S. are lockstep on tariffs on Chinese EVs, and Mexico has not been yet. And so there may have been that the threat or some hardball playing there, even if Kamala Harris had won. Yeah, transshipping, I believe, is the phrase, right?
Shipping, that as we all now have to become trade experts again. I thought that was in the past for me. Yeah. But you know, Marty, there is a rational self-interest that just screams you've got to side with the Americans in a fight with Mexico over dealing with China, because $4 billion goes back and forth across the border every single day, as we all know. There's a necessity to be aligned with the U.S. on this, because the dollars and cents just add up to too big of a pile.
Yeah, and look, I saw this topic today come up, and I was like, I'm in the world's biggest game of Groundhog Day. I feel like I was sitting in the exact same spot about 6 years ago talking about this, a little less, well, actually probably the same amount of hair in my head. But anyway, it's the exact same thing, and I said the same thing then. Protectionism begets protectionism. Economic nationalism begets economic nationalism. Once a big player, the United States, comes out and says what this says, everybody's going to sort of try to close ranks on itself. That's number one. Number two is it's easy for Canada to throw Mexico under the bus to a certain extent, because there is an understanding on the part of the Canadian government that while this is a trade agreement between three countries, given how politicized Mexico, the southern border is, Canada doesn't like to be lumped in with that. Mexico was a huge issue in the 2016 election, less so this time. But the fact remains, the whole bit about illegal immigration, et cetera, so it's taking American jobs, that kind of thing. Canada doesn't like to be associated, so it's very easy to throw them under the bus.
Right.
The third thing I would say is just sheer precedent. I think what you're seeing now between these countries, like this sort of thing will be happening all over the world now that Trump has sort of come back and is saying that he is into tariffs, economic nationalism, protectionism. I think this is going to be something that doesn't just affect North America. It's going to affect Europe. It's going to affect Africa, et cetera. The whole world's going to sort of have to fall in line with this new way of thinking.